Hello, everyone, and welcome back for another episode of Woven Wings Live, where we bring you wisdom and tools for vibrant living. I'm Gabe Crane, and I'm joined by my co-host Rahul Deedwania. And if you enjoy listening to us, please share our work with a friend or leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. And you can also join our newsletter, which is linked in the show description, to follow along the journey. This week's episode is called The Art of Decision Making, and we have a decision making expert, Nell McShane Wulfhart. Now I'll have to check if I got your last name right there when you come on. But Nell is a decision making coach and an expert in the field. And yeah, this is a really interesting topic. I think I'm going to turn to you pretty quick, Rahul, because the decision that we made to have this episode on this topic arose out of your and my organic process. One of the things I love about this project with you, we get together, we talk about what's going on in our life and within our lives, and really try to draw from that what is interesting and what feels alive and valuable to talk about, to record, to share with everyone else. And so maybe you could start us out today. Just why did you want to explore decision making, and that led us to getting connected with Nell?
Thank you, Gabe. Yeah, this was a topic that came out of some of my own reflection. And for me, the reflection really more recently has been that I find myself oscillating between periods of feeling more decisive and just naturally decisive and less decisive. And recently, it's been more in that camp of feeling less decisive. And it's interesting. Like, I don't totally understand why. I felt it sort of just encompass even some like smaller decisions, like, oh, what color paint should we get for our office room, or what color paint should we get for our guest room, and just things like that, or like, what should I have for dinner, all the way on up to feeling a certain level of like a lack of certainty around larger decisions, like where to live, what type of work to do. And so it's been interesting to observe. And overall, decision making is super important, right? I mean, we're making so many decisions day in and day out, and then professionally too. So that's personally, but then professionally also working with people in business and leaders in particular. Decision making is a big topic. How effectively are people making decisions? How much are they taking in inputs? How agile are they after the fact? All different aspects of decision making. I've been thinking a little bit also about like where some of my early influences and frameworks around decision making came. And I think, one recent one that I found really powerful is this idea of like, there's a lot of emphasis placed on making the right decision when really a lot of the work comes after the decision. And so there's something to be said around making the decision right, or at least at minimum, like learning after the decision and being agile and understanding that you're going to learn more after a decision is made rather than in the process of anticipating a decision in the future for too long. And, I remember learning this lesson in high school, part of this space settlement design competition. And basically, we had some mentors. And one time when I was leading that effort, the mentors really emphasized, they're like, make a decision fast, and learn from it after the fact. And while I don't believe that framework always applies, there's obviously nuance to this. There's something to be said for having a consistent way to think about decision making. So I'm really excited just to dive into that with someone who lives and breathes that world. And so with that, we'll pass it over to you, Gabe.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's going to be interesting. Hopefully, we'll get a chance to troubleshoot and look at some of those scenarios you were talking about in your own life as a way for us to kind of make this topic more real and understandable. And, very briefly, I can just relate to that. One of the things I used to chalk it up to being a Gemini, but one of the things I used to do and notice is like when I'm hungry and I go into the supermarket, if I'm not in a good place, I used to, I sit on the aisle and end up comparing these products to one another. That doesn't make any difference, really. It's just like, just choose one, buy it, and then you'll be able to go eat. But sometimes getting hit with this kind of paralysis, on like a very low stakes thing like that. And then on a larger stake thing, one of the things I'm interested to explore today with Nell is, certainly in certain spiritual disciplines and practices that I'm personally connected to, there is this emphasis on becoming present and on, I guess, rechecking your facts or examining your assumptions about why you're perceiving a situation the way that it is. And I think that that's very helpful in kind of gaining understanding and insight into what's really driving your perception, what's leading you to kind of make sense of the world and the way that you are, and then perhaps reorienting that and that having an impact on your choices, on your decision making. But on the flip side of that, I think it can also, again, lead to paralysis. You can get to this point where there's no end to that process. And spiritual practice, which is, I think, meant to help us awaken or lead a meaningful life, can be itself just a continuation avoiding and hiding, of trying to stay away from stepping up into our life. And so that's one of the questions I'm curious to kind of explore here today, is where is that line, and how do we balance that? The recognition that we don't always know what we don't know, and at the same time we need to make decisions and take actions to move forward in our life. So on that note, I do want to introduce Nell. Nell is from Philadelphia, and she's an author, freelance writer, and for the last 10 years, she's been a professional decision maker. She offers only one thing: a single session in which she'll help you make a big or small decision. She gives straightforward, no nonsense advice that helps you get unstuck and moving forward. She's helped everyone from poets to hedge fund managers, Olympic athletes to politicians, moms to college students. She's helped people decide where to move, what job to take, which career switch to make, whether to get married or divorced, whether to have kids, and pretty much anything else you can imagine. You can learn more about her at her website and newsletter, both at decideandmoveforward.com, which is linked in our episode description as well. And in addition, Nell is going to be debuting her own podcast, The Decision Coach, which will be debuting on Audible in January. So that's an exciting thing. Also, if this conversation sparks interest for you, there's going to be a lot of good content coming out in the new year on this. So Nell, with all that said, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show. Thanks for being here with us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so I know you've been listening into Rahul and I kind of chit chat here at the outset, and I'm curious if you have any kind of off the cuff remarks or takes on what we shared. But maybe alongside that, or broader than that, I think just to start this conversation at the top and try to frame it for people, why is decision making important? Why is it important that we get better at it? And how will it make your life better if you do get better at decision making?
Actually, Gabe, this sort of connects to what you were just talking about how we can kind of get bogged down in our spiritual exploration. And it's really the same with decision making. Like people can get so bogged down in trying to make one particular decision, or as Rahul was saying, like a bunch of small decisions, that it kind of sucks all the joy out of your life, as well as being just like an enormous waste of time. So, my attitude toward decision making, and the reason that I think everybody could get better at it, is that the quality of our decision is not really correlated to the amount of time we spend making it. I mean, after a particular point, when it comes to making big decisions, obviously we want to think about them and weigh the pros and cons and really, think it through. But so many people go way past that point. And after that, you're just losing like hours or days or sometimes months or years trying to make a particular decision when you could have been actually taking action on it. So that's my main thing. That's why I think decision making is so important, and getting faster at it and better at it is important, because you're just saving time and you're getting a lot of like mental space back as well.
Yeah, no, that's super relatable. I'm thinking about certain decisions as you were talking about. I was just like, the different things are popping up in my mind. I was like, yeah, I've spent a lot of time agonizing over a decision. And it's often funny how, either you come back to the thing that felt right at the beginning, or even if it's different, you go off and operate off of a particular decision and then learn something and realize, hey, maybe you weren't even thinking about all the right things to begin with. So
Right.
a lot of interesting things would love to dive into with you, coming off of what you said. Another contextual piece I'd love to learn is, what inspired you to get into this work? Like, how did you get into it? What are maybe some hard decisions that you've had to make that maybe pointed you in this direction, or that have helped you hone the way you think about this? And yeah, just curious to understand a little bit more about your story before we keep going.
Sure. I've just always been that person that like friends and family come to when they have a big decision to make. I have an ability to kind of just like see like the clear path forward. And sometimes it comes just like, oh, I'm not in the situation. I can provide like a clear third party perspective. Also, I love telling people what to do. Like I love giving advice. I love making suggestions. I love being like, oh, like take this thing, and I can see how like, people get stuck in the personalities or their worries or their anxieties, but I can see like what's on the other side of that. So I've spent a lot of my life just being the person that people would turn to when they just wanted some like straightforward help and advice. But along with that comes the personality trait of like giving people advice all the time when sometimes they don't want it. And I think eventually someone was like, shut up. Maybe other people want this, but I don't. And I was like, maybe other people do want it. So, I threw up a website and I started offering it. And it turns out that a lot of people have trouble making decisions. A lot of people struggle with it, like so many more people than I imagined. And so I just get to sort of dive in there, give a totally neutral third party perspective on somebody's decision, outline the steps moving forward, and then they just go off and move on with their lives. And it's really, really fulfilling, I have to say.
Yeah, so that is one cool, I think, and unique part of your business model now is, it's like it's one meeting, right? One decision. And so I think we're going to get into this in a second of, what are some of the exercises and tools people can use. But could you just comment on your choice around that way to structure your business? Why do you like to just have a single meeting? And is it, what benefit does it bring you? And how is it helpful to the people who come and meet you?
That's a great question. When I started out, I actually offered a few different packages, and one of them was like 3 sessions in a row. Like if you were making a really big decision, like that I would do 3 sessions with you. But I very quickly realized that by the time you're coming to a stranger on the internet for help with your decision, you do not need to think about it anymore or talk about it anymore or work through it anymore. Like you have thought this thing through. There is nothing more that anybody else can add. And what you actually need is action. So then I realized, okay, I'm just offering one session, one decision, one session. And in that session, like we will get this decision made. And then when the session is over, you know what to do and you know how to do it. You can go off and take action. But it's kind of goes back to what I was saying at the top of the call of just like the amount of time people spend wondering and thinking and debating. And I just want to clear all that away. Like, let's just get this decision made and move on with your life. And I promise your life will be better than if you took more time and more discussion and more thinking.
Yeah, and you've started to allude to this a little bit where you mentioned people being, when they're in a decision, they're feeling a certain amount of anxiety or a certain amount of maybe clouded thinking. But I was curious if you could characterize, what is it that makes people struggle to make decisions?
I always say that the decision making business is really the regret minimization business because people are terrified of feeling regret. They're terrified of making like the wrong choice, of going down a path that's going to make them unhappy, of looking back and thinking, oh, I wish I'd done that other thing. Like it's the fear of regret that keeps people really stuck. And look, there's going to be regret. And often when people come to me with a big decision, it's inevitable that there was going to be regret either way. If you're coming to me to ask, like, should I have a baby? Like, okay, if you decide to have a baby, you're giving up a lot of things that you love. If you decide not to have a baby, you're giving up a lot of things you think you're going to love. Like, there's no path that is free from regret. And so once that can feel a little depressing, actually, but I think of it as kind of liberating because once you know that you're going to feel some regret and feel some pain, like, okay, it's going to happen anyway. So, like, what's the best path forward? It becomes a little easier to see that. But for me, that is absolutely what people get bogged down in, is like they're so nervous about making the right decision and not having to feel that regret that they just can't move forward in any direction, which I promise you is worse than regret.
Let's dive into then some of these tools, which I think you're alluding to some already, but people are coming to you with a big decision, whether to have a baby. You threw that one out there. And one of the things is minimizing regret. But when you're working with someone, you're I guess you guys meet for a couple hours or whatever it is. Where do we start? What do we need to be thinking about when we're making a big decision ourselves? Where do we start to get onto a track to getting to a good outcome?
Sure. Well, first of all, I should also say that I deal with decisions that are much smaller than that. Like somebody once called me for help deciding whether or not he should get a tattoo removed. And someone else has called me about like what color should they paint their kitchen. So it's like it really runs the gamut. It's not right. It's not all as as major as like should I have a baby. But there are a couple exercises that I ask all of my clients to do. And people who are listening to this, they should absolutely try these at home. Super easy, and you'll find them like really helpful when you make decisions. You do not have to call me. The first one is just to make a list of your values, not religious or spiritual or moral values, literally a list of the things that make your everyday life good, the things that you enjoy in everyday life. And this can be anything. This can be recognition for your work. This can be time with your dog. This can be sleeping late on a Wednesday morning. This can be financial independence. It could be on my list is like the ability to wear sweatpants every day. You can't see them, but I'm wearing sweatpants right now. Like I want to be very comfortable all the time. And I never set the alarm clock in the morning. Like that is super important to me. I've arranged my entire life around that. So really anything goes on this list. So you make the list of values of things that are important to you in your everyday life. And then the second exercise is to cast your mind forward as best you can into the future and write out what you would like your ideal life to look like in 1 year, in 5 years, and in 10 years. I will say up front that people hate doing this exercise, that they really struggle with it. And I get that. I also get it. Like it is really hard to imagine what you want your life to look like in the future. But both these things together can be super helpful when it comes to making a decision. I can talk a little bit about why, if you'd like.
Yeah, I would love to. I think visioning as a general exercise is something that we as coaches, lean on quite a bit as well. But would be curious to see, so you have this now, right? A vision of a few years from now and a couple of different stages. Where does it go from there?
Yes. Well,
And
first
why
of all,
does it matter? Yeah.
it matter. Yeah. First of all, I love when people get really specific about it. A lot of people have get a dog. Like that's on their list of like the future life that they want. Like a surprising amount of people have get a dog on there, which is a very achievable dream. But the whole idea of going through this and making a list of goals and the things that you know that you want in your life is to give you some direction. Because once you have actually spent some time thinking about it, which is something a lot of people have not done, it just can put your decision into totally new kind of perspective. I'm thinking of things like a lot of people might put down like, oh, in 5 years, I want to have my own business or my own practice. But the decision they're calling me about is like, should I take this job offer or should I stay in my current job? When you see that in 5 years, you want to have like a thriving business of your own, it really, really reframes the decision. Like, actually, the decision should be like, when do I start my business? How do I start my side hustle? When do I go out and get clients? Not like, should I take this other job that is just going to delay me from getting what I want? It just puts your all your decisions into perspective in terms of like, is this in line with my long-term goals? Are these two choices in front of me? Which one is going to get me where I want to be? And I love if people can draw a straight line to where they want to be from one of the choices that they are deciding between. I'm not talking about a wavy, long line full of lateral moves and ifs or whatever. I'm talking about like, what are the choices in front of you will get you to the future that you want faster than the other? That's probably the one that you should do.
So I'm kind of curious. I think it'd be awesome, Rahul, if you're up for it, to kind of apply and let's try to apply this into maybe what color you should paint your kitchen, or another decision you're facing. But really quick, one question before we do that now is you mentioned getting there faster. And so this kind of goes back, maybe we'll talk more about this later, but I think it goes back to kind of the spiritual framing that I introduced at the start of the show. So why is faster better? I know this is kind of like a big philosophical thing, but like, why is getting somewhere faster better than not?
It's because people aren't enjoying the journey. When you're stuck trying to make a decision, you're not happy. You're not enjoying yourself. You're not actually achieving anything. Like you're think like, oh, I'm gaining self-knowledge or something, but real talk, probably not. You are probably just spending time on something that is causing you stress, that is making you anxious, that is making you worried, and it's not helping you get to be the person you want to be or living the life that you want. Like faster is not always better. It's not a universal rule, but when it comes to making decisions, I have found that it is almost always better to take some kind of action. Later, you can pivot. My favorite expression is you can always change your mind, but you just get so much more to work with once you like take action and start moving forward.
All right. Well, I think that's a good segue. I feel like there are a couple of examples that I'd love to run through with you now. And the reason I mentioned a couple is I think we'd love to do one that's very mundane and then one
Mhm.
that might feel maybe a little bit bigger than that. And then potentially, an even bigger one. So you mentioned this idea of painting, the kitchen. And, I was raising my hand when you were talking about that because my wife and I, we recently moved into a home in May, and we have a couple of rooms, right, that we've been wanting to paint. And I think at this point we're getting close, but it's one of those things where we've been dragging our feet a little bit on like, well, what do we, what color should we use? Should we go sage? Should we go light blue? Should we go dark blue? Should we have an accent wall? Should we not have an accent wall? You know, and so here it is. I come to you with this problem, this decision.
Mhm.
I'm curious how you take me through this.
Right. Well, first of all, I love an accent wall. But honestly, this is like a great example of decision that people spend so much time on that like it truly does not matter. You can paint it, and I will tell you that there is no perfect decision that we could come to right now in this session that would guarantee that you love what ends up on the walls. Like it depends on the time of day, it depends on the light, it depends on the mood. So given the fact that like there is no perfect thing or it's impossible to envision the perfect thing right now, it doesn't matter. Pick the cheapest thing. Pick the thing that was your first instinct. How you hold 4 color samples behind your back and have your wife like pick one sight unseen and move forward with that one. They're all good. If you spend all this time thinking, narrowing it down to like 4 or 5 possible colors, any of them will be fine. And if not, you just paint it again. Like this is something where I can even not, I'm having a hard time like dealing with the idea that you guys have been talking about this for hours or days or weeks when you could have been doing like so much other stuff with your life. Like if you're not enjoying those conversations or you're finding them more stressful than enjoyable, then literally just like pick one at random, paint the wall. If you don't like it, repaint it. But don't spend any more of your life on that particular decision.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm just gonna play out some of the maybe the objections or the paralyses that have been
Sure.
playing out. Because what you're saying, right, makes sense. Like, just do it, and you'll see if you like it or not, and you go from there. And then there's the other part of me that's like, well, it's going to be this whole lift to paint it even once. And, are we actually going to paint it again? Or are we just going to live with what's there, even if it's not great? And then, oh, actually, the like feel of the room is like so impacted by the paint or by the color, by the vibe, like so important to get it right. And so just voices that are popping up in my head. So I offer
Totally.
those to you. And what would you do with that?
Totally. Well, first of all, when people tend to push back like that, it is often because it's like a little bit more anxiety brain than it is about the actual decision. That they're just like they're stressed about it and they're worried about it, and it's not really like the paint that's important. It's just like this kind of they've gotten themselves into like a spiral of like, should we do this? But what about that? Should we do this? What about that? And it just becomes kind of like a self-reinforcing habit. The
Yeah.
second suggestion I would have would be to do what I think you've already started doing, which is test those colors out. Put some of those colors on the wall. You don't have to paint the entire room to know if it's right or not. Paint a small part of it, test it out, and then you'll have much more information. And this is, I think, something that people can apply to almost any decision that they are trying to make. test it out, even in a small way, because the way we make good decisions is not by doing what you're doing right now, Rahul, which is like sitting at home and wondering if you're going to like this or that. It's by doing the thing. And then even if you do it like just a little bit, or you just put a little bit of the color, or you just like try a little bit of a new hobby or a new, I don't know, side hustle or something, all of a sudden you have real tangible data on whether or not you like the thing. And if you do, great, you double down, paint the whole room. If not, okay, that's useful information. Pivot, you try something else. But like test those things out as much as possible, not just paint, but like almost every decision you're trying to make, test it out. And then you have real information that you can use instead of just like more wondering. Do you know what I mean?
So if I could just interject here, one thing, so in your first response, Nell, it was kind of like, again, with this kind of faster theme, right? It's like, well, just make the decision, right? Because you want to save the time. It makes me think about SMART goals, or having time-bound goals. That's the T in SMART when we think about making goals. So is it important? I would imagine so, based on what you're saying. It's like, give yourself a deadline or a time frame, like put that paint on the wall, or like you're making this choice by Friday at 3, something like that. If you can't make it in this moment right away, it certainly can't go on till next week. Is that kind of the idea?
Oh yeah, I love deadlines and accountability. And occasionally I'll get a client who like I will offer to email them in a week to make sure that they've done the thing that we decided, because it's like, it depends on your personality, right? Some people need that external accountability. That's what helps them move forward and take action. And I'm happy to provide that with like an email or phone call or something. But yeah, I love the idea of, especially when it comes to something like paint. Paint is also a especially difficult one, because like until it's on there, you don't really know what it's going to look like. As you can see, I'm sitting in a room that's kind of the color of like a swimming pool. Did not plan that. Like that's just how it turned out. But yeah, I would say absolutely, like some kind of external accountability or a self-imposed deadline. Most people know what works for them, right? With this kind of thing. Like if they set a deadline for themselves, they know whether or not they're actually going to stick to it. If it's a stranger who is like checking in on the deadline, maybe they're more likely to stick to it. People generally have a good idea of like how to keep themselves accountable. So yes, set that up for yourself, 100%.
Yeah. So if I'm tracking correctly now, there are a few questions I feel like that you've introduced that we should ask ourselves, right? One was this piece of, am I actually enjoying the process of evaluating this decision? If yes, then hey, maybe just for enjoyment's sake alone, you continue to evaluate it, right? It's part of the process, it's part of the enjoyment. But more often than not, what I'm hearing and what I can relate to is the process is not necessarily that enjoyable. And so if that's the case, then a couple other test questions that I'm hearing in there is, can I test the options, right? In a small way, in a big way? Is there any way in which I can test the options? And is it reversible? Or is it something that I can change my mind on, like you said? If so, I'm picturing a flow chart, I guess. If so, yes, I can test it. Yes, it's reversible. Then just do it, and get there faster and use whatever accountability mechanism you need to get into action. But action is preferable to evaluation if those conditions are met. Does that sound about right?
I think that's really a great clarification. Like those 3 questions, those 3 themes, I think are really important. They can be applied to almost any decision for sure. And I think people will find as they, work through a decision using that framework, that they can test out more things than they think, and that more decisions than they think are reversible. Like sometimes you lose time, you lose money, you lose whatever, but almost every decision can be reversed. Like nothing is written in stone, or very few things.
One additional element I think I'm hearing you say too now there is it important, right? Like what is the level of importance of this decision?
Right.
Because if it's not that important, then, make it and move on.
Yeah. And everyone's definition of important is different. The woman who called me to ask what color to paint her kitchen had been agonizing over it for months. Like this was a really important decision for her. And as Rahul was saying, like, yes, the paint is important. It impacts the feel of the room, et cetera, et cetera. But in the long term, like if you threw yourself 10 years in the future, would you look back and think like, wow, I'm so glad I spent all those hours trying to decide on the paint color of the living room or the kitchen or whatever? Like it's unlikely, right?
Well, even though you didn't intend it, it's a great feel with this swimming pool background for you now. I think it's just a really good feel from that. So, you're great.
Yeah, I do know what I just got used to it because I didn't want to go through the hassle of painting it again. So I was like, fine, I'm just going to like it.
So there's maybe a half a tier or tier up type of decision now that I'd love to run by you as well.
Great.
That's, so this is probably the one that motivated this topic for me when I was talking to Gabe. Is recently I've been feeling a lot more, I wouldn't even say paralysis, but just like a lack of grounding or uncertainty around the decision on like where to spend my time and the specific tension that I'm navigating. There's a part of me that's like, really, this year 2023, I was like, hey, I really want to like dedicate myself to like work and my craft and learning and writing and reflecting and just like have a sort of an individually focused year of growth and to approach it with almost a single-minded attitude. And then there's the other part of me that is much more the deeper part of me also, I'd say, that's like loves connecting with people, spending time with people, being present in as many places as possible. And what I find is that these two things come into tension quite regularly, right? And there was a point maybe early in the year where I was much more grounded and taking one approach or another and just being okay with whatever outcome came out of it. And more recently, it's felt like a recurring tension where I don't feel like I know which value, using your word, like which value to be operating from, right? And what to be focusing on right now. And so there's this decision, or this becomes a decision or a set of decisions that I feel like I'm making over and over and over and over again, to a point where what I was telling Gabe is I'm tired of even thinking about it. Like it's like
Right,
there's
right,
that
right,
fatigue that you were talking about, right? Where I'm
right.
like, oh man, this decision making process is like so not fun, and so I'm curious, taking something like that, which I imagine is relatable on at least a few levels to other people. How do you tackle something like that?
Oh, I totally understand that feeling, and maybe it's something about 2023, but I was having that kind of struggle at the beginning of the year also. Like there were a lot of different work projects I wanted to work on, and I didn't know which one I should be focusing on, and I was sort of going like, trying to do everything at once, but not doing anything well. And yeah, it's a horrible feeling. You feel scattered, you feel unfocused, you feel like you're kind of letting yourself down, possibly other people down. It's a really stressful position to be in. I totally understand that. Okay, so there's a few things. First of all, there are a lot of studies that have been done that show that we as humans are very bad at knowing what's going to make us happy in the future. This might seem at odds with the fact that I make everybody list out their ideal life in the future, but it's not really, because there are some things that we do know, right? Like we know we want to be in good health a year from now. We don't want to be stressed about money a year from now. Like we know we want to be, talk close to our family, whatever. We want to be having time for our hobbies. Like there are some things that we can know about what we want in the future. And I think that can be helpful to zoom out a little bit and think about those when you're trying to figure out how you're going to spend your next 3 months or 6 months or year. I also think for a lot of people, it can be helpful to shift the time frame, like to think like, oh, 2023 is going to be the year of this. Like that can be a lot. Like sometimes it is too much to look in the face, and therefore just scale it back. Like, what do you want to do in the next week? What do you want to do in the next month? I'm a very big fan also of like seasons, like when you feel really caught between something like, oh, I want to be spending time building my community and connecting to people close to me, but also focused on my career. Like work-life balance doesn't have to mean like all the stuff is happening at the same time. Sometimes you can work more and then you have more life later. Like it doesn't have to be every day or every week the same thing. So I like the idea of, taking these two goals, maybe that you had, these two particular ones, and deciding, okay, like January is going to be focused on work. So you know that like every day morning in January, you wake up, it's work. Like that's your priority for the day. February is going to be community or connection. So in February when you're like, what should I work on now? You're like, oh, the theme for February is connection. So I dedicate myself to connection. Like you can expand or shrink the time frame as necessary to like the point at which you are comfortable, because it can be really difficult to think about like the whole year's worth of goals or the whole year's worth of plans. I think those are two things. Those are like really quite practical things I think that people can do. And in the absence of that, I also encourage people to look at that list of values that I mentioned earlier and to think about The list of values can change also, right? Sometimes you feel differently than others, but to make sure that whatever you're working on, that it is aligned with those values, or at least some of those values. Because when we do things that are not in line with those values, like we're just taking a shortcut to being unhappy. And so to make sure that that is like always the focus, it's always the thing in front of you. Is that helpful at all?
Yeah, it's definitely helpful. And, I think I'd love to just do one follow up on this, Gabe, if that
Yeah.
works, which is, so the way you characterized it, by the way, was spot on, right? I think all those feelings around disappointing myself, disappointing others, not leading up to the things I want to do, blah, 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 like all of that is there. Maybe part of the struggle for me is it feels like they're, both tracks, right? Community, work, whatever, are both expressions of the values that I want to be
Mm-hmm.
operating from. So I don't feel out of sorts or disconnected from my values in either context. And if anything, it's more this tension of like, to your point, maybe I don't do all of it at once, but then what does that season look like? How long should the season be? I think intuitively, that 2023 thing came to me,
Mm-hmm.
and you're right. It feels heavy, right? To put a whole year under it.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious, how do you even arrive at seeing it that way if you're in my position?
Well, first of all, I would encourage you to ask yourself if there's a third option. People come to me often with a very binary decision, and then we realize, like, oh, actually, there's a third choice that kind of is actually better than the first two. So if you have these really strong values of like developing your career on one hand and community and connection on the other hand, like, can those overlap in some ways? Is there a work project you could take on that would involve your community? Is there some kind of thing you could work on, I don't know, with your wife or whoever? Like, is there a way to bring those two things together? And then you don't feel like you're doing one to the exclusion of the other. I think, just as also this is something applicable for anybody making a big decision, like, have you considered all the options? Sometimes when people are stuck between two options, it's because they don't actually want to do either of them. And there might be a third possibility out there that is like the thing that they actually want, and it could be possible. So just if you can zoom out a little bit and take a look, I find that can be helpful. What it comes down to, Rahul, with this kind of decision is that no matter which thing you work on, it will be good because those are both in line with your values and they're both things that you want. So if you're working on one thing or you're working on the other, it doesn't matter. You're advancing towards your goals and you're living your values. That is good. So first of all, you should like take away any kind of like guilt or shame about spending time on one thing and not the other, because both of those things are fully in line with your goals and your values. So and I think that the important thing is not to spend so much time thinking about just in the moment, deciding in the moment. Let's say like making decisions in advance is a tool that everybody can add to like their toolkit, and it can just help you so much. Like that idea of waking up every day and being like, what am I going to work on today? Like, what was I thinking about? Like, no, absolutely not. Decide at the beginning of the week or the beginning of the month or whatever, so you know what you're going to do in advance. Because if you're every day like reconsidering the things that you could possibly work on, first of all, it's a huge energy suck. And by the time you actually get to the thing you want to work on, you could already half your energy is gone. But also it just takes more time. It's a waste of time. So like any progress in any area is a good thing, and just decide in advance. And I don't care if you're like flipping a coin. As long as all the goals in front of you and all the options in front of you are in line with your values and they're going to get you where you want to be in the future, it truly doesn't matter what you work on. Just flip a coin, pick one thing, work on that.
So one of the things I hear in Rahul's story here is the conflict of values. And I love what you said, Nell, of like, well, they're both your values. So just, whichever one you're working on, split it up. But I do think that there are decisions. I hope you can help us. Maybe there's a better way to understand this. I'm sure there is. But the way I currently think about it, there are certain decisions that come around sometimes that really put our values into conflict with one another, or that's how, we experience them. That's how I experience them. On the one hand, we want one thing. If we go in that direction, it's going to impinge on or harm a certain set of our values. And then if we go in the other direction, it'll be the opposite. And yes, sometimes there's options or opportunities to split things up, find that third way. But beyond what you've already said now, what would you say about that kind of experience of your values? Okay, you've got your values kind of laid out, but they are kind of in conflict with one another. And I've got a couple other layers to this when it comes to values, but let me pause there and just see what your thoughts are.
Can you give me an example of the sort of situation you're thinking of?
Say someone is, if we go to like bigger or higher stakes decisions. So you mentioned having a child Or let's think about someone deciding whether to get married or even more intensely, maybe whether to get divorced. And their values are their family, their children. But on the flip side, their values are their own well-being, the way they want to feel on the day to day. And I can imagine in that scenario, there's all these different sets of things around even judging the values that, you come up with. You mentioned what, not your moral or spiritual values, but what makes your life awesome in the everyday? Like, what do you actually utilize every day? And getting into spaces there where you might be able to identify what you like, but you feel a certain judgment around that because if you're taking care of other people, there's other people involved. It's selfish to be looking at the things that you like to do. So all of these sorts of things kind of come into potential conflict with one another in a situation like that. Does that help to clarify? Is that like a good scenario to play with?
Yes. Okay. Let me say first of all that it's hard to sometimes to give like hard and fast rules that apply to every situation. And that's the reason that people come to me is because like sometimes they just need to this is like a very personal situation. And really what I am doing is I am trying to figure out what the person wants to do. And in that situation you just described, say like you value family and closeness and all these things very highly, but also like maybe you want to leave your partner and go somewhere else or do something else, and these things are in conflict. I will say that in personal stakes decisions, especially like when it comes to staying in a relationship or leaving a relationship, this is more than any other decision, like a feelings decision, like what the person actually feels and what they want to do. And they already know that. Like it is somewhere in them deep down. And that kind of one of the secrets of decision making is that people pretty much just do what they want to do, especially when it comes to like, let's say romantic decisions. They're just going to do what they want to do. Like almost nobody stays in a relationship with the potential of like romantic happiness with somebody else. Like it's just really rare. People do what they want to do. That's the way it is. It's fine. And my job is to figure out like, what is it that you want to do and how you can do it with the least harm to other people around you. It's not really a question of like your values are in conflict. Like, sure, values are in conflict. And we find that with other decisions too. But it's more like, okay, you know what your values are. If you dig deep and you know what it is that you actually want to do, how can you enact that decision that is in alignment with your values? Like, how can you make sure that you are being as kind to the people around you, that you are making, especially if there's something like children involved, like how can you make this as easy as possible on them? How can you prioritize like their happiness while also getting what you want? But really, it comes down to like what that person wants to do, like in their gut. They don't think it has to do with that. They write out pros and cons lists. They make long, agonizing arguments, but it almost always comes down to that.
Okay, so that's a really interesting place to get to, and I'd love to get your take on that. You just mentioned gut, deep feeling, intuition. We started out with our values, our flow charts, our worksheets.
Yeah.
And now we get down to this deeper layer. And I'm curious, like if you could share just what is your perspective on that? So we have some deep gut feeling, we have some intuition. You've said that as much. What do we do with that? Should we always be following that? Everyone here on this call is a coach. I know there's plenty of coaches out there that will tell you always should just be following your gut instinct or your intuition. Is that your perspective? Are there things we have to look out for there? Do we need to differentiate between different kinds of impulses and instincts that we might feel? How do we make sense of this deeper layer of life that feels so important and kind of more closely connected to who we really are?
I think gut and like instinct can sort of be code words sometimes for like, I'm just going to do what I feel like doing and like, forget all y'all. Like it can be sort of like, oh, I'm following my gut, I'm following my instinct. That can lead to like hurting a lot of people. It can lead to like making big changes that might not serve you in the long run. It can sometimes feel like an indulgence. But I will tell you that people, it's also like it's kind of a conflation of words sometimes, that like people generally do what they want to do. That's not exactly the same as instinct, but like somebody will call me about a job offer. This is a very common thing. Like they got a job offer, should they take it? And they're like, oh, I don't know. Like, my gut tells me I shouldn't take it. There's something wrong with it. Like I have to push back on that a little bit. Be like, okay, like why? What are the things about it that are giving you pause? Like, don't just say, oh, it's my gut, it's my feeling. Like, let's figure those things out. And if we have to write them down, then we have to write them down. But like, there is something to that there is no pure instinct, or like the universe is not speaking through you. Like there is a reason you feel that way. And when we figure out what that reason is, then we can decide whether it's a good reason or like a legitimate reason or a silly reason. Or like once we've actually examined, like maybe it's just fear of starting something new. Like, okay, then we know something. We can start with that. We can work on that. Like, do you face your fear? Do you just give into it? Whatever. You can take some action from that point. But I feel like a lot of things get filed under gut instinct. And if you just like push a little bit or like ask some more questions, you can figure out like what that thing actually is, and like you can put a name on it, and something is not quite so vague as instinct.
So if I'm tracking that correctly now, it's that emotion or intuition is maybe a gateway to more information, is what I heard. That hey, you're having this feeling, but okay, let's examine the feeling and see what's underlying it. And there might be a point where you keep going down and you're actually there's nothing underneath it, right? And that might be the core desire. You're saying people do what they want. It might be that you're like, hey, like this is just what I want, and there's nothing underlying it. That's it, and that's kind of what ends up shining through anyway, is what I'm hearing. Does that all sound about right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you're really good at distilling my long diatribes into much shorter sentences, so I appreciate that. But yeah, that's essentially what it is. And just like it's always worth pushing back on instinct. Just to like, not that it's bad to go with your instinct, not that that instinct is necessarily leading you to a bad decision, but like let's figure out like let's put a name on that actual thing. Let's keep digging. For sure.
So one other piece, Rahul, I don't know if you have something you want to go here with, but okay, people do what they want. That's, I think we're kind of centering on that too as something that is generally speaking healthy. Sounds like what you're saying now is like connect with what it is that you want to do and do it. When we get into, I guess, especially social living, right? We want to do something. This is like the birth of politics, the birth of family dynamics. It gets complicated. We want to do one thing, other people want us to do something else. Sometimes talk about morals or religions. We have some people think about we have certain things we want to do, but there's like higher values that we should be aspiring to. How does any of that, I know that's not necessarily the vantage point you're coming from, but do we need to look out for or check what it is that we want? Just thinking, I do some work in an addiction recovery center here. And sometimes when we're dealing with addictions, we want things that aren't good for us, that create problems in our life. Can you just nuance this a little bit? Like, so yes, we should follow what we want. That leads to kind of flow, clear decisions. What do we have to be looking out for or aware of when we're getting in touch with that?
Yeah, I'm not saying everyone should just do what they want all the time. Absolutely not. I'm just saying that when people come to me with a decision, like in almost any sphere, like job choice, career change, moving abroad, having a kid or whatever, like in those situations, they've already examined them, and like neither choice is going to cause a lot of harm. No one is calling me and be like, well, like I have this addiction and should I indulge it or not? Like it's like that is not what people call a decision coach for. And certainly people are usually too thoughtful about their decisions. When we're talking about just like doing what you want all the time, like those people are not questioning their decisions. They are not agonizing over their decisions. They are not spending time making those decisions. If you're calling me, like you've already spent a lot of time thinking about this. You've examined it from all angles. And if you are going to cause some kind of harm with it, like you've figured out a way to deal with it, or you've become okay with it, or, you've come to terms with it in some way. So for sure, like I'm not just saying like, I'm just do we feel like doing all the time. I'm just saying that for most people, probably most people listening to this podcast right now, if they're making a decision, like they're not making a decision that is really going to hurt a lot of people or cause a lot of harm. Like the person that they have to please with the decision is themselves. And that most of the time it's okay just to do the thing that you want to do. Like people want to take a job, or they want to make a move, or they want to get divorced even. Like it's mostly okay just to do that thing. And I will also just say that when there is an idea that has been buzzing around in your brain for a long time, like whether that's moving or baby or divorce or whatever, like for months or years or whatever, in my experience, that thing will not stop buzzing until you try it out. That like you can say like, oh, well, it's better to stay in this relationship for the sake of the kids or the sake of my partner or whatever, even if I'm not happy. Like you're not going to be able to stop thinking about the other thing, about the other option. Like it's always going to be there buzzing around. And there's a point at which you're just going to test it out. And I am a big, big fan of making the decision and getting the hard part over with so you get to the good part faster. Not like stretching out the decision making and then stretching out the difficult choice. And then the good part is like really far off in the future.
Yeah, what you just said there now is bringing back to this idea of like the emphasis placed on making the right decision versus making the decision after the fact, and this idea that what you said earlier that I've been noodling on, right, is, hey, a lot of acting in accordance with your values also comes after a decision. So you might have what feels like two values in conflict, but actually you can bring in if you choose one direction, direction A, you can bring value B into the direction A route as well. And it's maybe a more, you just have to figure out how to do that. Question that I'm thinking about here is, again, my mind is going to like the flow charts and all that. And I'm like, yeah, as we're talking about it, this all like makes sense, right? It all seems to be logical enough. And I'm like still noodling on that early question that we talked about, which is like, so what happens then, right? When we're in the process of making a decision, how do we lose sight of this? And what is it that, so I guess the question is like, what is it that can like help with the mindset, right? Our mindset of staying grounded in these decision-making principles that we've been talking about?
First of all, I should say that I'm a little bit allergic to the word mindset. But I mean, I just feel like it's can be kind of misused, or it can push a lot of systemic responsibility onto the individual, which I feel like is kind of unfair. But I just want to talk a little bit about what you said about what happens after you make the decision. I think this is super important. It's something really people should think about, which is if you make a decision, the way to make any decision, like the so-called the right decision, or to feel like a success, you need to, once you've made the decision, you need to take action that is for the reasons you made the decision. Maybe Rahul, you can distill this into a clearer sentence, but like I'm going to give an example. Like if you decide you want to retire early, your dream is to retire at 45, and then you're just going to do whatever you want, like all the time, et cetera, et cetera. And then you're calling me about like, oh, I just got like a job offer, like for this really stressful, but like really well-paid job. Okay, so you decide you're going to take this really stressful but really well-paid job because it's going to help you achieve your goal of saving a lot of money and retiring early and traveling the world. The way you make that decision a success when you're in the middle of those 100-hour work weeks or whatever is that you know that you are actually saving the money, and when you retire, you start traveling the world. Like you have to do the thing that you're making the decision for. You have to, if you decide you're not going to have kids because you want to have like total freedom and you want to like live in a van or whatever, you better go live in that van. Like if you don't live in the van and you don't have kids, then you feel like you're losing out on both things. But like you have to make sure that you're really following through with the reasons for making that decision, and that you're really taking advantage of the benefits of that particular path. Like I cannot emphasize this enough, that you have to, if you move to a new city because you're like, I want to meet so many people and they've got great pickleball teams or whatever, like you better be sure that by the time we get off the phone, you have scheduled like, your next pickleball tournament in that city, and you have set up 3 different coffee dates with people to meet people. Like you have to do the thing that you're actually going for. You have to like live out those reasons. And that is how you can make almost any decision a success, honestly. It's not quite a secret, but it's a little bit of a secret.
Just on that note of carrying things out, we had this question. It's maybe a little bit of a non sequitur, but I think about what happens if you're unable to carry your decision out, or the circumstances beyond you make it so that, I don't know, you're not able to move to that city and schedule the pickleball thing, or you don't get to live in the van or whatever it is. I mean, some of those might feel like far-fetched. Like I'm imagining like people who are in prison or something like that, or displaced or something like that. But I think we're always kind of, I think in a more common sense, confronted with this idea of maybe not getting what we want. And so what would you say to that if we're faced with decisions that we can't carry out, or we can't access the positive goals or the positive things we thought we would get from them?
People actually call me all the time, and they present like 2 or 3 options that they're trying to choose between. And when I push, it becomes very clear that like there's 1 or 2 options on that list, like they're never actually going to do that. Like they don't want to, or it's impossible for logistical reasons. Like people hate to get rid of choices. So they put everything on the list. And then like I just had a client who was calling me about, where should she move? She lives in a place in California. Should she move to a different place in California? Should she move somewhere else in the United States? Or should she move to like one of 3 countries abroad? And after 15 minutes, it became very clear that like she wasn't going to move abroad. It wasn't the right time. She had just come from abroad. Her kid didn't want to move abroad. So I was like, are you actually going to do it? Like, you have to be honest. And she was like, no. So great. Take yourself off the list. So like, honestly, anyone trying to make a decision, that's a great starting point. Like ask yourself if you're really going to do any of these things. And if not, just take it off the list. Like, let's stop making decisions for the kind of person you think you might become one day, and just make decisions for the person you are right now. When it comes to the point where like you've made a decision and you can't take action on that decision, I'm not sure that's really a question about decision making, but I would say look to your values and the things that like otherwise make your life good. Just lean as hard as you can on doing things that are otherwise living out those values. B, are you really sure you can't do the thing? People tend to limit their options more than necessary. And like sometimes, there is a way to do the thing, even if it's not the way that you act like originally dreamed. Like say you want to live overseas and you got a job offer overseas. And then all of a sudden the job offer was rescinded. People are like, oh, well, that's it. Like now I'm stuck here. Like, are you? Maybe you can find another job. Maybe you can pick another country. Maybe you can move to a place for 3 months and just the length of a tourist length visa. Like, I really encourage you to like zoom out and think creatively about other ways that you could get to that goal, because people have a tendency to be like, oh, well, that option went up in smoke. Like, that's it. I'm just going to sit here and look at the wall. But really, like, if you think a little bit creatively and maybe you work a little bit harder, you can find sort of an alternative path to getting what you want.
No, this has just been a really thought-provoking conversation. And I think the piece that I'm thinking about right now, building a little bit off of what you just said, but also what you said a couple of minutes ago, was this idea of like, once you've made a decision, you need to follow through on the reasons that you made that decision to begin with. And what, even this idea of like being unable to carry it out, it's like, well, if you're unable to carry it out from the beginning, then that was never really an option. If you can't carry it out now, hey, if it still matters to you, can you reconnect with those reasons and find a creative way to do it anyway? I think there's a lot of power in that. And the question that I was thinking about is like, how do you deal with regret, right? Or buyer's remorse? You make a decision. Maybe it's something that's a little bit less reversible than like a paint color. Maybe you buy a house and you're like, hey, I'm going to commit to living in a place for a few years. And then you're like, I don't know, is this right? Is this not right? And you're, and what's coming to me is like, hey, one, it's probably still reversible if it's really that bad. The other part of it is, well, what were the reasons you chose to live there? Are you actually following through on the things you liked about the neighborhood, the lifestyle that you envisioned? Are you actually putting that into motion? And so actually the real question that's coming to me then is, how do you increase the likelihood? Like, what are tools, tactics, whatever, to increase the likelihood that you actually follow through on those reasons? Because I think what often can happen is after you make the decision, you get caught in the tide of something or the other, and then you might go back to your decision making, you might question it, second guess, buyer's remorse, rather than staying committed to making the decision right or following through, or all the things we've been talking about. And so how do you do that? What are some ways you can stay connected to that?
100%. I think that's a great question. And as much as possible, I would say make decisions in advance. This is always like my thing was like, the more you make decisions you make up front, the fewer decisions you have to make later. If you decide that you're going to take a ceramics class on Tuesday night and you sign up for it and you pay for it, like when Tuesday comes around, like you're not like, oh God, am I going to go sign up for that ceramics class? Like it's already signed up for, it's paid for, you're probably going to go. So you have to set yourself up for success in every possible way. Even people who are super indecisive do occasionally have like, maybe it's like the first hour after they have their morning coffee on Saturday where they're like full of energy and they're going to get things done. Like, yourself, lean into that and just make like a whole bunch of decisions right away and make them irreversible. Not like every decision is reversible, but like commit to them. Let's say, pay for that class, do that thing. I think one of the scenarios that came to mind, Rahul, when you were describing that is people call me all the time about moving to a new place, like moving to a new city. And I always tell them like, okay, you're going to get swept up in logistics, packing, moving, apartment rental, all this stuff. But before you even start any of that, I want you to look at this new city, find like 3 things that you like doing and sign yourself up for it. That things that are scheduled to happen in the 2 weeks after you arrive. Because people are like, no, I'll figure the friends thing out later. I'll figure out the community later, the hobbies, whatever. I'm just going to get there and get set up. And what happens? They get there, they unpack their apartment, and all of a sudden they're like sitting there like, I don't know anybody. I don't have any friends. I have nothing to do. And they panic and then they regret their decision to move there. But before you go, you like commit yourself to coffee date with a friend of a friend, a ceramics class, like you join a basketball league, you find a gym, and you put those things on the calendar in advance. So then you get there, you unpack and you're like, oh, it's Tuesday evening. Like I have my first meetup, my first book club to talk about, I don't know, historical fiction, whatever it is. Make the decisions way, way in advance. Don't leave it to your present self to make decisions, because your present self will often be too tired, be too lazy, be too depressed, be too whatever. So when you're in a good place and a place that's full of energy and you're not too stressed, make a whole bunch of decisions for your future self and they will thank you.
That's awesome, Nell. I think that's very, very insightful and helpful. And I think we're moving towards wrapping up here. And in a moment, ask about, I think you've already given us and our listeners, lots of great nuggets. But if there's takeaway you have for people. But before we get to that, I actually wanted to circle back and just ask you, just from your own experience, what's one of the best or hardest decisions that you've had to make in your own life, and how has it benefited you today, if you're something that you're open to sharing?
Yeah, I was trying to think about this, and I have to say that in general, I make my decisions very quickly. It's possible I underthink a lot of decisions because I'm always like, what's the worst that could happen? I'll be fine. And so far, knock on wood, that has turned out to be true. But I can think of one small example, really. It's not a big example, but moving abroad. I'm actually currently in the process of moving from Uruguay to Switzerland. And this is a decision that has a lot of pros and a lot of cons. And I have to just kind of reassure myself that even though there are a lot of cons on the other side, I'm aware of them now, and I'm making the decision with my long-term happiness in sight. I'm really, really trying to keep my eyes on the prize in terms of future Nell and what is going to work out better for her. Because for all of us, for all my clients, for all the people listening, the best thing you can do for your future self is to give them as many options as possible. Now, for people who are indecisive, many options can sound like a horrible thing. They don't want more options. They don't want whatever. But anything you can do to set your future self up for okay, in 10 years, I want myself to be able to have enough money that I'm not stressing if the dishwasher breaks, or, that I want to be in do enough exercise now that I can be in good health in 10 years. Anything you can do now that will set your future self up for more freedom to do what kind of jobs you want to do, for the ability to move wherever you want to move, to have savings. So maybe you can stop working for a little bit if you want, that you can have all those choices in front of you and not be limited and unable to move to do the things you actually want to do because of the lack of decisions that you made 10 years ago. So yeah, I would just encourage most people to think about their future selves and what they would want for them.
Well, now just seconding, what Gabe said, that this has been such a rich episode in terms of tools and questions and practices that people can use to really up-level their decision making, and to use some of your terminology, right? To get out of being stuck thinking about the decision and get to the good stuff faster, right? And I think there's just a lot of beauty in that. And as we start to approach close here, I'm curious if there's one takeaway, if we can even get to something like that you'd want to leave our listeners with.
I think we've covered most of my major talking points and the things that I really, really believe in. I would suggest, this is going to sound radical for some people, but if you're trying to make a big decision, I would suggest take the amount of time you think you need to make the decision, whether that's a week or a month or 6 months, and cut it in half. Honestly, I would say cut it down to 10% of the time you think you would need, but people freak out when they hear that. So I'm going to say, take the time. If you think you need a month to make a decision, give yourself 2 weeks. If you think you need 6 months to make a decision, give yourself 3 months. And I can promise you that the quality of the decision will not be affected, and you will get those 3 months of your life back. That most people, they spend, like I said, I cannot say this enough, people spend way too much time making decisions, and there's a point at which there's no new information is coming in. Sure, do your research, make your pros and cons list, think your decision through, talk it through with some people if that's helpful to you. But there is a point in every decision when no more information is coming in. No more new information is going to arrive to suddenly magically help you make up your mind. And all the thought process and everything after that is wasted time. I would just advise everyone to give themselves half the amount of time that they think they need to make a decision, put some kind of deadline on that, some kind of accountability, whether it's internal or external, and you're just going to find yourself moving through life happier.
Awesome. Well, Nell, thank you so much for joining us today. For folks listening, again, this is Nell McShane Wulfhart. Did I get that right in the in the intro? Mm-hmm. Okay. And you can find her work. It's in our show description at decideandmoveforward.com. Also, again, Nell is going to be debuting a podcast on Audible in January. That's going to be called the Decision Coach. Is that right now?
That's right. It's going to be coaching sessions where I coach. In each episode, I coach somebody through a big decision.
Awesome. Cool. So keep a lookout for that. That's debuting in January on Audible. And I know I'll be tuning into that myself. And Nell, I just want to say thank you again for joining us, taking the time to be here, share your insights with folks today. And if you are enjoying listening to us, and if you found benefit in this episode today, please share it with a friend. Leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. And you can also join our newsletter to follow along on the journey. Wishing you a great day full of healthy, effective decisions for your future self. And we'll see you out there. Thanks so much and see you next time.